Hello, my name is Ms. Shaw and I am a teacher in residence here at the National Museum of the Marine Corps, where I'm coming to you from our distance learning studio. Today I would like to talk to you about a defining period in both Marine Corps and United States history, World War I. World War I is a significant event in United States history because it was one of the first events that the United States participated in on the global stage. Although the United States had been a part of foreign conflicts before, like the Spanish-American War and the Boxer Rebellion, World War I was different for a couple of reasons. First, the scale of the war was something that the world had never seen before. The war involved over 30 different countries and was fought on multiple continents worldwide. Secondly, as a result of industrialization, the types of weapons and methods of fighting were more gruesome and deadly than past conflicts. Lastly, the decisions made at the end of the war during the peace process would have lasting impacts that arguably are still being felt today. World War I was also a monumental event in Marine Corps history. World War I provided the Marine Corps with the opportunity to prove themselves as one of the most prepared and determined fighting forces the world had ever seen, earning them the respect of other militaries and the nickname of the Devil Dogs in the process. In order to understand the significance of World War I, we first need to look at how the war began. To do that, we have to understand what else was going on in Europe in the years prior to or before the outbreak of World War I. Many historians focus on four major causes for World War I: militarization, alliances, imperialism, and nationalism. These main causes can help us understand what led to the outbreak of the war. Let's start with militarization. Militarization refers to the massive buildup of many European nations' weapons supplies and military forces. Although militarization allowed for people within the country to feel safer and better protected, citizens in the neighboring countries began to be worried about their own safety, which then prompted them to build up their military as well. This became dangerous because if and when a war began, the large numbers of weapons and troops ensured that the war would be much more deadly and destructive. Next, let's discuss alliances. Alliances are agreements between different countries that in the event of a war, they would support one another. In the years prior to World War I, many European nations began to make alliances with one another, creating an interconnected web of alliances that basically divided the continent into two opposing groups. These alliances became known as the Allied Powers and Central Powers. This system of alliances also meant that one single event could effectively pull all of the countries of Europe into war with one another. Imperialism was another cause of World War I. Imperialism refers to the expansion of many European nations as they created colonies throughout Asia and Africa. These colonies were important to the countries of Europe because they provided them with natural resources that they needed to produce many goods, and they provided markets to sell these goods to. Therefore, the countries of Europe competed with one another to obtain the most colonies, which created tension among them. The last cause of World War I was nationalism. Nationalism is an intense form of patriotism or loyalty to one's country. As citizens in each European country became more nationalistic, tensions began to grow between each nation. Additionally, nationalism can also refer to the desire of one particular group to create their own nation. This occurred within the Austrian-Hungarian Empire during the years leading up to World War I, as ethnic groups like the Slavs wanted to have their own country. In fact, it was this particular issue that provided the spark that put World War I in motion. World War I began after a group of Serbian nationalists assassinated the Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to Austria-Hungary. As a result of the assassination, Austria-Hungary and Serbia went to war with one another and called on their allies for support. This, in effect, drew many of the other European nations into war as a result. Once the war began, the European continent was effectively split in half, as most European nations were either a part of the Allied powers or the Central Alliance. The major countries that were a part of the Allied powers were Great Britain, France, Italy, and Russia, while the Central Alliance consisted of Germany, Austro-Hungarian Empire, and the Ottoman Empire. As the war began, each nation was given the opportunity to test out new weapons that they had developed as a result of industrialization. Some examples of these new types of weapons were machine guns, flamethrowers, poison gas, tanks, and aircraft. Additionally, countries made major improvements to weapons that had been used in earlier conflicts, like rifles, mortars, and artillery. These new weapons were deadlier than any previous weapons and brought about a new type of warfare known as trench warfare. Trench warfare was a method of fighting in which opposing armies fought from and defended their territories using a system of dugout trenches or ditches. This helped them to protect themselves from some of the weapons we just discussed, like machine guns and rifles. The way that trench warfare worked was by having opposing armies facing each other, each with their own network of trenches. And in between each system of trenches would be an open piece of land called no man's land. System of trenches could be miles wide so that the enemy military could not get around them, or they could span up to 300 yards long. Trenches would typically be dug around 12 feet deep, but could be smaller or deeper depending on who was digging them. In order to attack an enemy's trench, soldiers and Marines had to go over the top of their own trench and then run across no man's land. While doing this, their enemy would be firing at them the entire time, which made this type of attack very dangerous and deadly. However, World War I was not just fought on land and in trenches, it was fought on water as well. Shortly after the war began, Great Britain utilized their strong navy to blockade Germany. In response, Germany relied heavily on a type of vessel that could get around the British blockade, a U-boat or submarine. Germany began a policy of unrestricted submarine warfare, in which they started to target not only the military boats belonging to their enemies in the Allied alliance, but they also began attacking merchant vessels that were carrying war supplies to their enemies without any warning. In 1915, one such attack got the United States very close to declaring war on Germany. You see, the United States had tried to stay neutral, meaning that we didn't take a side at the beginning of the war. Many Americans felt that this was a European conflict, and the United States should not get involved. However, on May 7, 1915, that started to change when a German U-boat attacked a British passenger ship named the Lusitania. The Germans stated that they attacked the ship because they believed that in addition to carrying passengers, the Lusitania was also carrying war supplies. As a result of the attack, over 1,000 passengers lost their lives, including 128 Americans. This led many people in the United States to call for war against Germany. However, United States President Woodrow Wilson maintained a policy of peace and worked out an agreement with Germany to ensure freedom of the seas for American vessels. However, positive relations between the United States and Germany did not last very long. In January of 1917, a telegram was intercepted between Germany and Mexico. This telegram was a secret diplomatic communication issued by German Foreign Officer Arthur Zimmermann, in which he proposed a military alliance between Germany and Mexico. If Mexico agreed to this alliance, Germany promised that at the end of the war, Mexico would be able to reclaim the land that they had lost in the Mexican-American War, which is most of the present-day southwestern United States. Shortly after the United States found out about the Zimmermann telegram, Germany reinstated its policy of unrestricted submarine warfare. As a result, Americans once again began to call for war against Germany. On April 6, 1917, the United States Congress voted in favor of war with Germany. The United States therefore supported the Allied powers against Germany and the rest of the Central Powers in World War I. Now I am here in our World War I gallery, where I would like to talk to you about the important role and accomplishments of the United States Marine Corps in World War I. We will also take a look at some of the equipment that Marines used during this time to help them achieve their missions during the war. After the United States Senate declared war on Germany, the country immediately began to mobilize for war. The first United States military forces began to arrive in Europe in June of 1917, and began to serve alongside their French and British allies. However, the United States military would not be up to full strength in Europe until the following year. This was because it was very difficult to move an entire military force and all of the supplies needed for war across the Atlantic Ocean from the United States to Europe. In order to achieve this task, the United States military used almost any type of boat available, ranging from cruise ships to seized German ships. Additionally, the United States did not have a standing army ready to be deployed at this time. This meant that our military was relatively small, and in order to win World War I, it would need to get a lot bigger. In order to achieve this, new recruits were needed, and many citizens either volunteered or were drafted into military service during this time. Once a new recruit began their military service, they still needed to be trained and transported to Europe. And this whole process took quite a bit of time to accomplish. The Allied forces' enemy at the time, the Central Powers, knew that it would take the United States a few months before they would be at full strength. So their goal at this point in the war was to try to defeat the Allied forces before the United States was able to become fully involved. In the spring of 1918, the German troops fighting for the Central Powers began a very strong attack against French forces, and they began to take over a lot of ground as they pushed towards the French capital of Paris. This set the stage for one of the most important battles in United States Marine Corps history, the Battle of Belleau Wood. Upon arriving at Belleau Wood in the French countryside, the Marines had a very difficult task. The German forces were already dug into trenches at the wood line and had machine guns and artillery set up to defend their position. In order to defeat the Germans, the Marines would have to cross a wheat field with no natural cover like trees or hills to protect themselves, and then attack the German soldiers in their trenches. French forces who had already tried to accomplish this urged the Marines to turn around and retreat because they felt that the attack was too dangerous. However, the Marines continued on. After over 20 days of fighting and the loss of many lives, the Marines were able to claim victory for the Allied forces. The Marine Corps was given a lot of recognition for this victory, which is due not only to their bravery during the battle, but also as a result of the reporting on the battle done by Floyd Gibbons. Floyd Gibbons was a war correspondent during World War I who worked for the Chicago Tribune newspaper. As a war correspondent, Floyd Gibbons was embedded or stationed with the Marines who fought at Belleau Wood. His job was to report on the developments of the war and then send his account back to the United States so that Americans on the home front would know what was happening. As a war correspondent, Floyd Gibbons was not given a weapon to defend himself. Despite this, he advanced across the wheat field with the Marines. During their advance, they came under intense machine gun fire from the Germans. Floyd Gibbons was shot 3 times during this attack as he tried to protect one of the Marines in front of him. His wounds were so bad that no one thought he would survive. Because of this, Floyd Gibbons' communication that he had sent that morning was published without any censorship in newspapers across the United States. His communication read, "I am up at the front and entering Belleau Wood with the United States Marines." This was important because up until that point in the war, the United States military had censored all war messages, so that those at home did not know which forces were fighting on the front lines. When Americans read Gibbons' words, they knew that the Marines were responsible for the great victory at Belleau Wood, and this gave the Marines fighting in World War I recognition for their bravery and valor. Marines were also known for their resourcefulness during the war. Going into World War I, the Marine Corps was not provided any motorized vehicles to help them complete their mission. They had to make do with anything that was given to them by the other branches or donated to them by private individuals. For example, this Model T truck is similar to the one donated to the Marine Corps by 3 women at the beginning of the war. The truck reportedly performed beautifully during the battle, carrying ammunition and supplies to the front lines and evacuating wounded. Now I would like to show you some of the other equipment that Marines and other members of the United States military used during World War I. Let's start with the basic uniform that many Marines wore upon arriving in Europe. At the beginning of the United States' involvement in World War I, they would have worn this green wool uniform. The buttons are even detailed with the Marine Corps insignia or emblem, the eagle, globe, and anchor. However, as the war went on, Marines were given the same basic uniform as the United States Army. This was because it was too difficult for the United States military to try to equip the Army and the Marines with two different types of uniforms. Instead, the Marines began wearing Army uniforms for the remainder of World War I. Another important part of a World War I Marines uniform was their helmet. Metal helmets began to be used during World War I as many soldiers early on in the war were dying from head injuries caused by shrapnel. Shrapnel refers to a hollow shell that was filled with small pieces of lead that would be shot out of artillery cannons. The shells would then explode and cause very serious injuries. Therefore, a Marine's helmet was extremely important to their safety. Although a helmet at this time would not protect Marines from a bullet shot from a rifle, it would protect their head from other dangers. Now, here I have two different helmets from World War I. Although they look almost identical, there is one key difference. One of these helmets would have belonged to a United States Marine. Remember before when I mentioned that everyone within the United States military began to receive the same equipment to keep things simple? Well, that was true for helmets too. However, some Marines were given permission to affix the Marine Corps insignia to the front of their helmets. That is why this helmet, in fact, belonged to a Marine. Another life-saving part of a World War I Marine's uniform can be found in this haversack. A Marine would want to have this draped around their neck at all times because in the event of a poisonous gas attack, they would need to be able to access what is inside, their gas mask, very quickly. Poisonous gas was a terrifying weapon used throughout World War I. And although both sides created gas masks to limit the number of deaths among their militaries as a result of poisonous gas attack, it was a constant fear for men fighting on both sides of the war. Here are the socks that Marines would have worn in the trenches. Aside from worrying about poisonous gas attacks or shrapnel explosions harming you while in the trenches during World War I, Marines also had to worry about their feet giving them problems. That sounds a little crazy, right? That in the middle of a war with many dangerous weapons being used, Marines had to care about their feet causing them to become sick. But it's true. During World War I, an ailment known as trench foot was a huge concern for many soldiers and Marines. This is because when you are stationed in a trench, it is very common for the trench to be filled slightly with water or mud, which means that your foot could constantly be wet. If your feet are wet for too long, the tissue in your foot begins to die and results in a condition known as trench foot or gangrene. If a Marine were to get gangrene, their limb may need to be amputated. Therefore, it was really important for Marines in World War I to try to keep their feet dry as best as possible. That would mean trying to change into dry socks whenever you could, but also hopefully having waterproof boots to protect your feet. The United States military actually experimented with several different types of boots throughout World War I to try to best keep Marines' feet dry. These boots would have been covered with a waterproofing chemical, and they also had multiple rows of stitching to make sure that the water didn't seep in near the sole of the boot. However, even with all of these improvements, many times these boots would still leak. Another important part of these boots is found on the bottom of the shoe, where you can see these small hobnails that were nailed into the sole. Now, this Marine didn't step on these nails by accident. These hobnails were placed there to provide Marines with better traction on muddy or rocky ground. Although when they were walking on a smooth surface, they could slip pretty easily. The last item that I would like to talk to you about today are these metal canisters. Although they may not look like something you would find in your kitchen pantry or cupboards, these canisters were what food was stored in for Marines in World War I. These canisters helped to keep food dry and fresher for longer periods of time. However, many World War I Marines were not very impressed with the rations that they were given. Some examples of the types of foods that they would carry in their knapsack would be canned meat and bread. Furthermore, many Marines longed for a hot meal, but it was usually really difficult to get the hot food from the kitchens to the front lines. So if a Marine wanted to eat something warm, they would have to heat it up themselves. Dishes like this one were really great because it wasn't just a plate, but it could also be used as a skillet and heated up over a stove or fire. A World War I Marine would carry all of these items with them throughout the course of the war in order to keep themselves both safe and healthy. Hopefully you notice that many of these items are much more sophisticated than what a Marine might have been issued during the Revolutionary War or Civil War. But it is also interesting to see how much more advanced the equipment used by Marines in later conflicts like World War II, the Cold War, and even today has become. Now that we have discussed the important contributions of the Marine Corps during World War I, as well as the equipment that helped Marines and other soldiers throughout the war, let's examine the different outcomes of World War I. The fighting of World War I stopped on November 11, 1918, after Germany formally surrendered. However, the war would not be officially over until June 28, 1919, when the peace treaty known as the Treaty of Versailles was signed. Negotiating the peace treaty was difficult, since the Allied nations did not all agree with one another on the terms of the treaty. Countries like Great Britain and France wanted to punish the Germans for their involvement in the war, and they wanted to use the peace treaty to get money to rebuild their countries. However, the United States had different ideas regarding the treaty. The United States President during World War I, Woodrow Wilson, came up with his own plan for peace called the 14 Points. He believed that if these 14 points were incorporated into the peace treaty with Germany, it would prevent another world war from ever happening again. When constructing his 14-point plan, Wilson examined many of the causes that allowed for World War I to begin. He knew that militarization, alliances, imperialism, and nationalism were major concerns that needed to be dealt with in Europe. Therefore, aspects of his plan limited Germany's military growth and promoted open agreements and free trade between nations. A number of his 14 points also dealt with creating new countries for different ethnic groups or ensuring that existing countries were allowed to form their own independent governments. The last of his 14 points was arguably the most important. Woodrow Wilson proposed that a League of Nations be created, which would provide countries with a place to meet and discuss their problems before resorting to violence and war. After Germany surrendered in November of 1918, Wilson traveled to Europe and met with the other Allied leaders, during which time he presented his plan for peace. Unfortunately for Wilson, the other Allied nations did not agree with many of Wilson's ideas. Instead, the peace treaty that was written would greatly punish Germany for World War I. Germany ended up having to pay the equivalent of $33 billion in war reparations to the Allied nations, and much of their land and colonies were taken away. However, the European leaders did agree with one of Wilson's ideas. The League of Nations was created, although Germany was not allowed to join the League until it proved itself to be a peaceful nation. Although the League of Nations was Woodrow Wilson's idea, there were many people in the United States who were not too fond of committing the United States to an international organization like the League of Nations. Some argued that the League of Nations would end up entangling the United States in more European affairs, while others felt that the League of Nations would take away the United States' ability to be a fully independent or sovereign nation. Therefore, when Woodrow Wilson returned from Europe and presented the Treaty of Versailles to the United States Senate for their approval, the document was contentiously debated. In the end, the majority of senators rejected the treaty because they did not want the United States to join the League of Nations. The United States would end up having to sign their own separate peace agreement with Germany in 1921. Without the United States as a member of the League of Nations, the organization was largely ineffective at ensuring peace throughout the world. In addition, in the years following World War I, many problems plagued Europe, like economic failures and the rise of a number of authoritarian leaders. Many historians argue that it was the poor terms set up in the Treaty of Versailles that would eventually lead to the conditions in Europe that set the stage for World War II. Thank you so much for joining me to discuss World War I. I hope that one day you are able to come and visit us in person here at the National Museum of the Marine Corps. From the Distance Learning Studio, I'm Ms. Shaw.